My name is Echookit Akello, Deputy Executive Director of NEMA. I'm here to speak about the air quality regulations that we are developing as NEMA in partnership with different government institutions, private sector, and also a few actors in civil society. I will let you know that in the development of these air quality regulations, we had to think a lot about what we wanted to be embedded in the National Environment Act of 2019, but also what we want to cover in terms of scope and content of the regulations. As you may be aware, in this country, we have a number of issues related to air pollution. Some of the sources of air pollution include vehicles. So there are vehicular air emissions that emanate as we drive our vehicles every day, coming from the exhaust fumes that we're exposed to and which are deleterious to the environment, but are also affecting our own health as human beings. So that's a major concern that we are taking into account as we develop the air quality standards and the regulations. The other sources of emissions include manufacturing processes. The different industries that we have in the country have processes and technologies that also contribute to air pollution. And so as we develop the air quality standards and the regulations, we are also focusing on the manufacturing sector in this country whose technologies and processes contribute to air emissions. The other category of processes that we're looking at include oil and gas. As we go into the development phase of oil and gas in this country, we have to prepare the necessary standards that can apply so that when they import the equipment, they are going to use the technologies that they are going to use in the production process, and also as the refinery stage kicks in, after of course the building of the refinery, we need to ensure that the relevant standards apply to the oil and gas industry so that they are prepared to purchase the equipment that we want in order to control the air pollution, but also to ensure that the contribution of pollution from their processes to the ambient air is minimized. And that takes me to what we have in the standards, draft standards for air quality. One of those elements that we're looking at is ambient air. Ambient air is the air you see outside, you feel outside of an enclosure, outside of a structure. So ambient air is very important to us because it is the air that we all breathe in. And if the air is polluted from different sources, from manufacturing processes, from oil and gas, from motor vehicles and other sources, it therefore means that even we as human beings get impacted. Our health gets impacted, and so we have to be very, very cognizant of that. Now, coming to the motor vehicle pollution issues, you may be aware that this is also related to the age of the motor vehicles. The older vehicles have higher emission potential than the newer vehicles, especially because the calibration of the engines is not to the tune, to the point that limits the exposure of emissions into the atmosphere. And that is why we are talking about the relevant standards for even imported vehicles into this country. And so as we look at limiting the emissions from motor vehicles, this should be discussed in tandem with the age of the motor vehicles allowable in the country as vehicles that we can import. I know a lot of people usually say, well, our country is poor, and therefore most of us can only afford second-hand vehicles. Yes, that is true, that most of us can only afford second-hand vehicles, but as a country and as a government, we can also put in place systems and processes that incentivize people to buy newer types of vehicles that will limit emissions in this country. That is a very, very important consideration. But alongside the standards that we are putting in place for motor vehicles, for ambient air and oil and gas, we also have air quality standards for occupational safety, especially for those people who work in enclosures. So the law will put in place measures to protect workers from exposure to pollution emanating from processes in enclosures. For instance, as you build your house, we do encourage proper ventilation so that you allow natural aeration to permeate the building. If you're building a factory or other such structure, we also encourage a lot of natural ventilation to allow that aeration to come in, but also that if it is a factory or such similar facility, you install equipment, processes and technologies that will control emissions in order to protect workers from exposure. And these workers are important as a workforce, and therefore you want to ensure continuity in the productivity of the workforce so that people don't spend so much time and money always going to the hospital to seek treatment. Instead they should be more productive, and therefore the onus is on us as the owner of a facility, as the owner of the workplace, in whatever capacity, to ensure that we have the relevant technologies, we protect our workers from enclosure. And this talks also to people who work underground, for instance, those involved in the mining sector. We also are cognizant of the fact that underground air should not be polluted. You've heard of scenarios where miners have died as they mine underground. So these regulations will also speak to that element of exposure of workers who are in underground facilities, among others. And so the regulations look at self-monitoring by the facility owner, but they also focus on the responsibility of government institutions. If you're an employer, if you're a regulator, for purposes of ensuring that there's a proper management and monitoring of air quality in the different aspects of your work in your jurisdiction. And so we call upon those facility owners whose work lends itself to exposure to air pollution, to actually have air quality action plans and monitoring programs in order to be able to monitor the pollution that emanates from their processes. So by and large, this is what we have in our draft air quality standards and regulations. We do expect that before the end of this year, that these standards and regulations will be completed and operationalized into law. We also look forward to the cooperation of different actors, different sectors that contribute to air pollution in different manners of life, in order to ensure that our standards are actually operationalized. You may also be aware that as the East African region, we are in the process of reviewing the existing air quality standards for the East African community. And Uganda is now developing its position paper under the leadership of UNBS, Uganda National Bureau of Standards, which is responsible for standard setting in this country, but also represents Uganda in the East African community. So we will be synchronizing our Ugandan standards on air quality with the East African standards, so that as a region we have standards that are at par and which can be implemented across borders, so that we protect our countries, our citizens, and our people from air pollution and from problems that emanate from air pollution.